Hello, everyone, and welcome back to FtBCon3. It is 2 p.m. Central Time on January 24th, 2015, and I am bringing you Lyz Liddell, Director of Campus Organizing for Secular Student Alliance, and she will be talking to us about identifying and addressing Christian privilege in intersectional spaces. And I will be taking questions for this. We'll hold them till the end, but you can ask those questions in the chat room. If you go to ftbcon.org, over on the right-hand side of the page, you'll see a set of very important links. The Pharyngula chat is where we are discussing on the side and giving any questions that you have for Lyz. So go ahead, Lyz.
Hi. Well, first, thank you so much for having me on here today. I'm very excited to have the opportunity to talk about this area, which is something that I do a lot of work with in my normal day-to-day work. And so I'm excited to be able to share it with a wider audience because I think it's something that can be really useful to a lot of different people. So as we get started, one of the first things I need to make really clear is where I'm coming from in giving this talk. I am a campus organizer. I am not an academic. I am not a professional researcher, activist, or writer on the issue of privilege. And so the experience that I'm drawing from for this talk here today is drawn largely from my own experience of what has worked and what hasn't worked, and the interactions I've had with other people. This is not a hypothetical, abstract, academic level privilege discussion. And as such, some of the language may be a little different from what's normally used in talking about privilege, and some of the things may not be quite in line with the standard recommendations of people who do this in a more formal way. This is much more of just a what we've found works best in these situations. So, what I'd like to talk about today and what I'd like to make sure we walk away with at the end of our discussion are these things. I would like us to have a basic understanding of the concept of privilege. I say basic because that's where I am, to be 100% honest. And I say that so that anyone who is watching this who says, oh, well, I haven't participated in a lot of these privilege conversations and I don't know a whole lot about it, don't panic and don't shy away from this. Having a basic understanding is really all you need to start addressing some of these things that we see in our society. From there, we'll move on to understand the role of religious privilege in American society, particularly Christian privilege. We'll learn to locate ourselves in the spectrum of religious privilege and oppression, and then we will learn how to apply some of the best practices for helping identify and then mitigate religious privilege in intersectional spaces. And I'll talk a little more about intersectional spaces as we get into that section, because it's kind of a big word. So first, let's dive right in and see what we can do to address the idea of privilege itself. So, dictionary definition here, privilege in any sense, whether that's in relation to gender or sex or sexuality or skin tone or class, simply means that you have access to or enjoy certain rights or advantages that are based on no more than your social identity or a social group membership. These are unearned. You have not worked to accomplish anything that gives you these advantages. It's not like getting a promotion at your job. They are unrecognized, and this is a really important part of privilege in that at its surface value it is invisible, and sort of one of the privileges of privilege is that it's invisible to the people who benefit from it, and you don't have to think about it. And it's also different from privileges gained in other contexts. Again, when you get a promotion at work and you have more paid time off or you have a flexible schedule, those are certainly privileges, but they are different from the sort of unearned and unrecognized societal privileges. When talking about privileges, it's very helpful to understand this concept called levels of oppression. And there are three large-scale levels that we generally talk about. The largest is cultural oppression. These are going to be values, norms, societal expectations, ways of thinking that form institutions and individual patterns of oppression. This is society-wide. This is going to be all of American society, or maybe even all of Western society. Within that, we have systems of institutional oppression. So these are social institutions or things like government, our educational systems, our media, institutions that maintain and perpetuate these oppressions, whether that's through laws, whether that's through how we portray things in the media, and societal norms. Finally, we have individual oppression, and these are going to be your personal one-on-one interactions, attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs that maintain and perpetuate oppression. And so this is helpful to sort of understand the three different levels that these operate at, so that you can differentiate the difference between a societal level oppression, which usually is the kind that will give you those unearned and unasked for privileges, versus an individual oppression, which when it manifests is going to look a little bit more like individual cases of discrimination. Talking about privilege is a really difficult thing, and the word privilege itself is actually kind of problematic because it's the kind of word that makes us all get our hackles up right away, and we tend to be a little resistant about it. And so I encourage you to not be afraid of talking about privilege, but recognize that it can be a little challenging. When we talk about privilege, one of the ways to frame it is in terms of the oppressing group and the oppressed group, which is to say the group that has a privilege and the group that is lacking that privilege. And we can break this down in a whole bunch of different ways. If we're talking about white privilege, then the oppressed group is going to be non-whites. If we were talking about male privilege, then there's the oppressed group of women. We have hetero privilege that's offset by oppressing LGBT people, able-bodied privilege, offset to disabled people, Christian privilege versus non-Christians. This creates a us versus them dichotomy. In every one of these cases, the privileged group gets to think of themselves as us. We have these privileges. And the other, the them, are the oppressed group who don't have that privilege. It can also create a lot of defensiveness. This isn't always the best route to allyship. And so one way to address that and to work to overcome it can be to recognize that this is what our identities actually look a whole lot more like, that we are intersectional people. We have many different identities that are all active in different ways. So we might have race, class, religion, physical ability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, age. There's a whole lot more out there. These are just some of the major ones. And each of us exist in an oppressed or privileged group with regards to any of these, and they overlap and they interact in different ways. And this, understanding this sort of intersectional identity aspect is a really, really good way to start a dialogue about privilege. Because when you come from an intersectional perspective, you're breaking down the singular us versus them barrier, and you're recognizing that all people have varying amounts of privilege and disadvantage. So the particular types of privileges and disadvantages differ. So you're going to have different privileges by being male than you would have for being white, for example. But the disadvantaged status is commonly shared across all oppressed groups. And so that's something where you can start to find some common ground. And finding common ground is going to be one of the first steps in helping you address privilege and religious privilege in general. From here, I'm going to turn a little bit and start talking about religious privilege in particular. So religious privilege exists where the beliefs, practices, and worldview of one group dominates and is accepted almost unconsciously by members of the dominant group, marginalizing all other beliefs. So, as with all privilege, it is again unearned. Whatever religious identity happens to be dominant, they get that privilege, and you don't have to work to become part of that group. It's unrecognized. Most people who benefit from religious privilege in our society do not realize the privilege they have until it is pointed out to them. And it is unasked. And this can be one of the hardest things to address in addressing religious privilege or in any privilege conversation, in that the privileged group didn't ask to have these benefits. It's just sort of the way our society happens to be set up at this moment. And so it can raise some defensiveness, some feelings of guilt, some feelings of defensiveness as we try to overcome something that we didn't ask for in the first place, but is causing harm to other people. In America, some really, really common examples of religious privilege are things like the prayers at football games, the National Day of Prayer, where our government gets together and embraces the tradition of one religion. The benefit of having an assumed morality, an assumed moral character. The question when you meet someone, oh, welcome to small town, what church do you go to? The fact that you can put a Jesus fish on your car or wear a Christian t-shirt and not face harassment for it. You have representation in your government, reflective of your worldview. You have educational opportunities within your worldview for you and for your children. These are all some of these advantages that come out of the concept of religious privilege. When that one group dominates and is accepted, some of these unearned and unasked privileges and benefits that come out of that. Religious privilege exists on a continuum. It is where there certainly is an us group versus a them group. We've found that it's much more helpful to recognize and think of this particular kind of privilege as being on a spectrum. Where over here on the green side of the screen, you have the privilege, the most privileged group, which is going to be your mainline Protestant Christian traditions. Going through to less and less privileged positions of minority Christian traditions, to non-Christian but theistic traditions, to recognized non-theistic religious traditions, over here to the pretty severely disadvantaged side of secular worldviews, non-theistic, non-religious worldviews. So we can break that down a little bit. The evangelical Christian going to the megachurch is going to have advantages over the Seventh-day Adventist, who is going to have advantages over the Jewish family, who is going to have advantages over the secular family. Now this may be a little bit different in some different contexts depending on what you're looking at. For example, we just came across a study a couple of weeks ago where students and recent graduates would place examples of their student organization involvement on their resumes, and any religious group or secular group mentioned on a resume actually harmed the opportunities of employment, with the singular exception of if that group was Jewish. And the Jewish student organizations helped the students get by far and away ahead of the other applicants in the study. So this is one where, although normally in a societal sense, maybe Jews don't have quite as many societal privileges as the evangelical Christian groups, because the context is different, suddenly they do have an advantage that wasn't visible before. So what's the impact that we're dealing with when we are talking about oppressed worldviews? Well, there's a bunch. The first one is the widespread societal oppression, distrust, even violence. If you look at how atheists are treated in American society, I'm going to guess a lot of people watching right now can have heard stories or have personally experienced some of those issues of distrust and perhaps even violence. And this is not exclusive to the secular community. You can see this in relation to the Sikh community and the attacks that have happened on Sikh religious buildings and institutions in the last couple of years, religious conflict in other parts of the world. There's a lot of negativity that comes out of this existence of the system of privilege and oppression. It creates divisions on issues that are not related to worldview where cooperation is needed. Let me give you an example. Global warming. We really need to be working together to address this problem. We really should be able to cooperate with one another. But if we are telling people that we are not welcoming to their participation because of their worldview, then we're turning away allies that are really valuable to us. Another really powerful and present example of that is the LGBT community that's working quite hard for marriage equality in the handful of states where it's still necessary, and of course ongoing societal acceptance of LGBT lifestyles. But the LGBT movement as a whole has been tremendously resistant to reaching out and accepting help from the secular movement and secular communities. We routinely hear on college campuses our Secular Student Alliance affiliate groups interested in participating in pro-LGBT, pro-marriage equality events, and the LGBT group says, no, sorry, we are not interested, we don't want to be associated with you. Where that cooperation would probably be really beneficial just in sheer numbers, but we have these divisions based on the worldview. The existence of privilege and oppression can prevent engagement and participation in certain activities. For example, if you're on a campus where the majority of your community service opportunities are done through interfaith programs that aren't aware of the impacts of religious privilege, then secular students are being excluded from service opportunities. Again, not intentionally. It's unearned, it's unasked, it's invisible. But the reality is that these effects happen. And last, the existence of privilege and oppression systems consume energy and focus that could be used on other issues. If we come back into climate change or world hunger or all of the other societal and global issues that we could be addressing right now, they could use our time and attention, and yet our time and attention is being consumed on managing this us versus them relationship. So we'd like to change this, which brings up the question, how do we manage it? Well, as it turns out, we're the oppressed group. We are not the ones in the position of power. And so the question actually becomes, how do we get them to manage it? How do we get the religiously privileged group to recognize their privilege and be willing to address it? And then once they're willing to address it, how do we help them actually do that? So I break this up into 4 steps. You'll want to set the stage, and you'll want to do so carefully so that the conversations and the dialogues, interactions you are having are productive and constructive rather than haphazard and fall prey to a lot of the common pitfalls of these privileged conversations. You should learn from other discussions about privilege. This is something that is becoming really wide. This topic is becoming widespread in our community. There's a lot of great research going on about it, and a lot of the concepts can be carried over from one movement to another. So whether you're looking at white privilege in a racial situation, or if you're looking at the men to women privilege issues, learn from those discussions, see what's working in those fields, and see if there are things that you can bring with you and apply to your conversations. I have a handy-dandy list of things that you should do and that you probably should not do that are specific to these interactions about religious privilege. And then I've got a couple of tools that will support your conversations when you get there. The other way I like to think about this is a little bit like the concept of managing up. If you're in an employment situation and you need to sort of help your manager learn how to do their job a little bit more, but you're not in the position to tell them how to do it, it's that subtle and valued technique of being able to manage upward and achieving the results through more subtle influence and conversation rather than direct overt influence or control. So I said we were going to come back to this idea of intersectional spaces, so here we are. And I want to go into a little bit about what I mean by that. If you are looking at this talk and you're thinking, wow, I'm going to go back and apply this to my secular group, I'm sorry, you're wrong. If you have this problem in your secular group, then you don't have a secular group. So what we're actually working with here are situations in which the religious privilege, the religious or Christian privilege manifests, and secular people are not dominant. And so there's a lot of examples up here on the screen. Things like interfaith programs, service projects, any kind of advocacy, activism, political demonstrations or engagements, community organizations, including schools, colleges, high schools, middle schools, government events or operations, progressive coalitions where a number of groups are coming together to achieve a common goal. I guess you could have any kind of coalition, but normally we see ourselves in progressive ones. Sport or social or intramural interactions, your bowling league, for example. And what comes out of this is the fact that we are often a minority within these contexts, and we're working as the oppressed group to inform the privileged group about their privilege. That role means there's some really specific strategies we can employ to maximize our success. So let's dive into those. The first thing we need to do is set the stage. And part of the process of setting the stage is recognizing that the conversation about privilege is going to happen and inviting people to have that conversation. A phrase that I've heard used before is a courageous conversation, where we're dealing with people in a very direct and authentic way. And we can go into a conversation knowing this, but it's really helpful if we also extend that invitation to the other party. Let them know what they're about to get into. We don't want to blindside people. Similarly, we can't just avoid the conversations. I guess if you're going to avoid the conversations, you also wouldn't be watching this talk. And so one of the pieces of advice I can give for setting the stage is to get that invitation to the conversation out there sooner rather than later. Don't give a lot of time for emotions to fester and grow. Try to get out ahead of these problems before they become really big problems with a bunch of misunderstandings and emotional baggage tied into them. But let people know that the conversation that's going to be had is a courageous one. Invite people to be direct and authentic. Invite people to be honest, and be straightforward that you are entering into that dialogue with the hope of a positive outcome that addresses the concerns and furthers interests. We've also found that it's extremely helpful to set some ground rules. And this is one where religious privilege and these religiously intersectional spaces have a strong thing you can pull from, which is that there is the same concept in just about any religious teaching out there, which we can sum up as treat people the way we want to be treated. So because discussions about privilege can often feel like an attack, it's important to remember that we're talking about an issue. We're not talking about a group of people, and we're not talking about people's character. Remember that privilege is unasked. The people you're talking to didn't ask to have these benefits. They probably don't realize they have these benefits. And so there's a risk of defensiveness that you can sort of get out ahead of just by recognizing and being straightforward that there's the potential to react that way. And then just remember that you would like to be treated, that you should be treating them the way you would want to be treated if you were in their shoes. Another really useful tool is to operate within this continuum. Recognize where you are on this spectrum, and if you can, recognize where you are on this spectrum in the specific context that you're in. For example, your location on this continuum may be different when you are in an incredibly progressive college campus environment versus when you are in your community's PTA in rural Iowa. And then you can use that location on this continuum to find allies. Let's go to our small town Iowa, for example. We're going to make a wild guess that the privileged group are pretty much the mainline Protestant traditions, and that any Sikh or Muslim or even maybe Jewish families are going to feel just as out of place and just as oppressed as you are as a secular person. There you have allies that you can work with to engage in these discussions and demonstrate that it is not just one tiny group of outliers who's being affected by the system, but that there are multiple people who are being harmed and who benefit from having these systems recognized and changed. And again, recognize that you have a lot of intersecting identities, and use that to your advantage in the conversation. You may not be able to convince a religious person in an entirely abstract vacuum that they have a religious privilege or that there's something they should even be doing about it. However, most people in American society have probably heard of Ferguson. Most people in American society have probably recognized that there's some gender inequality going on. And you can tap into those parallel movements and those other conversations to help people understand what's happening in this worldview system of privilege in a way that they might not be able to understand in a sheer vacuum. So again, here are some examples of things you might be able to tie into, where generally people have at least some areas more than other, show some recognition that there are systems of privilege and oppression in place, and that the systems of privilege themselves are maybe something we want to work to mitigate. And then you can use that to your advantage in conversations. One of the other things I have found to be particularly beneficial when addressing privilege conversations is to empathize with the privileged group as a grieving group. Losing a privilege can be thought of as a form of grief or grieving or mourning. And that gives a really interesting perspective to really empathize and build some solidarity with the people you're trying to work with. So privilege is a real thing. It has real benefits. Whether they're asked for or earned or visible or not, those benefits are actually there. And so when we ask people to surrender those benefits, we're asking them to take a loss. One of the examples I use for this is a little bit like finding a $20 bill and then being asked to give it away. Or you're walking with someone down the street and they happen to stumble across a $20 bill and you're saying, don't pick it up, man. Just leave it there, walk away. Except instead of liquid capital, we're talking social capital. And then finally, to recognize that there's often an emotional reaction to this. Whether that's guilt over enjoying the benefits of a privilege that you didn't earn or didn't ask for, or defensiveness about being asked to give up something that you have benefited from, or any other set of reactions in that spectrum. They're emotional reactions, and we're not robots. We're going to have feelings when things change in our lives. And so by recognizing that and building some empathy around that, we can better understand where the privileged group is coming from and help them gently ease out of the enjoyment of the privileges that they have. I mentioned that I have a couple of do's and don'ts that I'd like to share. These are very much gained from the experiences I've had working with a broad spectrum of religious allies in a number of different contexts. So some things you'll want to make sure you do. Build empathy. Use shared experiences. Locate yourselves on these continuums. Share stories of oppression. If you're working with an evangelical Christian who isn't really quite grokking the idea of their religion giving him a privilege, try to get them to talk about a time when their gender or their sex or gender identity led them to suffer a form of oppression. Share some experiences. Alternately, try to tie into the shared goals that you have together. If you're working on a service project together, you both care about the topic of your service project, or at least I hope so, otherwise why are you doing it? So if you're helping to feed the hungry, then you both have this shared goal of mitigating hunger in your communities. Lean on that. Use that empathy as a tool to have these conversations. You'll have to be a little bit of an ambassador to inform and educate about privilege and its effects. I totally put that apostrophe in there. I'm really sorry. And the effects of privilege. As widespread as these conversations are becoming in our society, we don't have a full understanding of it yet. We're all still people learning and understanding these issues. So you'll have to do a little bit of informing and educating, particularly about the issue of religious privilege. You'll want to provide reasons why it is, I did it again, oh my God, what am I doing with myself? Provide reasons why it's in their best interests to address the privilege that they enjoy. There are a number of resources out there for this, and whether that, including some of the ones we talked about earlier, being able to focus our time and energy on the things that are important to us and the issues that need them. Strength in numbers for shared goals. Being able to coordinate effectively on things that have meaning to all of you, to just generally provide a more supportive and happier society and to eliminate distrust and violence in our communities. These are all really good reasons to address privilege. There are also some things that I found that you don't want to do. We don't want to play the victim. And I don't mean to suggest that many of us go into these conversations intending to do so, but it's very easy, especially as a member of an oppressed group. The reality is that we've been affected by these systems of oppression, and that can make us really angry. If you've read Greta Christina's book on why are you atheists so angry, I bet some of those examples resonated with you, and they certainly resonate with me. And it's very easy to fall into those and to focus on the anger and the hurt. And I have found that very, very rarely is that useful in some of these conversations. Even in the context where it's useful to provide examples of the harm that privilege can cause, I've found largely it's better to use a third-person example than to say, this happened to me. That's not to say your stories are invalid. They're absolutely invalid. They're absolutely valid and should be discussed, but be careful how you frame them. This is not the time to attack the person's religion, their religious leaders, the Pope, their religious identity. If you're going to attack, then they're going to defend, and that's going to be the end of your dialogue right there. This is also not the time to attempt to deconvert them. I work with a lot of college students, and sometimes some of the students I work with have trouble backing off from the opportunity to tell a religious person all the reasons why they should leave their religion. This is not the time for that. There's absolutely a time and a place for those conversations. But at this point, we're not trying to get them to leave their religion. We're just trying to get them to recognize and mitigate some of the privilege and oppression that comes out of it. And last, again, I'm not expecting that any of you would actually try to do this directly, but be aware of your framing and be aware of how you're talking about these issues so you don't come across as blaming individuals for societal privilege. And in fact, in some cases, you may have to sort of overreach and reassure an individual that you're talking to that you aren't blaming them, that it is not their fault that this societal privilege exists. There are some great tools out in the wider world to support conversations like these. I'm going to give you a very tiny handful of them and then point you in the right direction to find more. One of the most powerful tools I have found is the concept called the invisible knapsack, and this was originally written in a 1988 essay about white privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. That's Peggy McIntosh. The original article helped to articulate the unearned privileges that whites could count on every day, but about which they remained oblivious. And so this concept has been applied to a number of different groups since then, one of which has been religious privilege. And so if you Google for 40 examples of Christian privilege, you'll find a couple different places citing the same article that give some really, really fantastic examples of the kinds of things that demonstrate Christian privilege in our society. Some of the things I mentioned earlier, like being able to wear a t-shirt displaying your religion and not being harassed about it. Being able to have your religious worldview displayed on your property, whether that's your home or your car, and not having it be vandalized. Being able to organize a group at your school around your worldview without being harassed or stonewalled by your administration. Just a lot of little benefits that religious people probably don't realize they have. It just puts them out in front of them so they can say, oh wow, I never thought about these. I never realized that this was something that I had going for me before. Another really helpful tool is just information. There have been a lot of surveys of the secular population in recent years. My big go-to survey is the American Religious Identification Survey, that's pronounced ARIS, and their last large comprehensive survey was in 2008, which is getting to be a couple of years ago, but they've done some updated surveys of smaller demographic groups since then, their most recent being last year a study that focused specifically on college demographics. But there have also been a number of recent polls by Pew, by Gallup, and a number of private polls run as well that can talk about the demographics of secular people in society. One of the biggest things you're going to get out of this is simply knowing how many people in our society are non-religious. It's somewhere between 15 and 30%, depending on what slice of the population you're looking at. That's a huge number of people. On the issue of framing, you probably don't want to make it sound like we have this giant army ready to run over everybody, but to point out again that these aren't just a tiny number of outliers who are being affected by something, that we're talking about millions of people who are routinely facing these lack of privileges or these systems of oppression. Another great resource that's available to you are a number of toolkits that have been recently released by the Openly Secular Coalition. If you go to openlysecular.org and click on resources, there are 10 and a number also undergoing development toolkits that really, really dig into the issues of, in particular, how to openly identify as a secular person. But from a practical standpoint, they also have tons of information on these systems of privilege and oppression and how that ties into the fact that being open can help mitigate some of these systems of privilege and oppression. The toolkits are fantastic. They have been really, really well researched. There's a toolkit for just about any audience group that you could possibly want, if that's you as a secular person, whether it's for a religious ally that you'd like to educate about these issues, parents, extended families. We have a guide for clergy available, employers, educators. So there's a whole bunch of resources available that you can use to help educate yourself and the people that you're talking to about these issues. And then my last one, this is a little bit of a cop-out. Back at the beginning where I said I'm not a professional expert on privilege in general, there are experts on privilege and privilege dialogue out there. Find them, talk to them, learn from them. The tools they use are going to apply to the conversations you're having here. And there's a lot of material out there that you can be working with. So go out there and use it. Let's not reinvent the wheel. So hopefully that gets you to a point where you feel like you have a little bit of a better understanding of the concept of privilege, religious privilege in our society, and some of the strategies that you can use to help start addressing those issues of privilege in the interactive spaces that you have in your life. I want to say thank you for joining us this afternoon. And if you have any questions at all, please visit the chat room and kick them over. I'll be happy to take questions from Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Liz. While you were talking, we did have a couple of people who were suggesting they were interested in hearing a bit more about the idea of managing up, or maybe a little bit more about what that is and some strategies.
Sure. Boy, that's a great question. That's something I do and haven't really thought a lot about how I do it. So the concept of managing up in an employment situation, I guess, is let's say you are working in an employment situation and you get a new boss hired in. Your boss, retires, resigns, whatever, and the company hires a new person into that position. And all of a sudden, you are reporting to this person who doesn't know. I mean, they may be experts in their field, but they may not know the minutia of how your programs work, of how your company works, of how your department works. And so you have to educate this person who has control over you. They have authority over you in a way that isn't going to threaten them, that isn't going to make them feel like they're inferior. And certainly you don't want to get on their bad side because they determine your employment. And so there's strategies there. And I have not thought to Google this. I'm sure that you could Google it and find more formal information. But the basic strategy really comes down to figure out what you need and what you need them to know, and figure out a way to convey that information in a way that they're going to want to receive it. And the best way to do that really comes down to just the golden rule again. If you were in their shoes, how would you want to get this information? What would be the best way for you to find out these things that you need to know? And sometimes that approach alone, that's usually my approach, is just be brutally honest with everyone, is, hey, I need you to know this so that you can be effective in your job and you can be successful. Here's what you need to know. So that's sort of the extremely condensed version of managing up. But sort of the key parallel is that you are the person not in the position of power, and so you have to be very empathic and very careful in making sure that the way you're presenting information is going to be received favorably.
And I will say, after listening to your talk, that all of this sounds like a lot of work. So it sounds like it's probably something where you want to pick and choose your battles and pick and choose your times when you have the resources to put into something like this.
I'm glad you said that, and I had actually meant to mention that back at the beginning of this, in that you absolutely need to choose your battles. You cannot fight this battle day in, day out. I do this for a living, and I can't fight these battles day in, day out. So recognize, you might need to assess sort of where you are and what situations you're dealing with, and then prioritize them. You may find that it makes the most sense for you to address this first in your children's school because your children are feeling the effects of this oppression before you try to take it to your bowling league or to your own employer. Because chances are you're not going to be able to have all these conversations at once. On the plus side, once you've had the conversation once or twice and you get a little bit of experience helping people become aware of these issues, you will learn what works and you'll become more effective at having the conversations in the future.
So, as someone who has had significant discussions on privilege, how do you decide basically when to cut your losses?
That's a great question, and I think that I don't know that I can answer that question, because I think maybe the answer to the question is that that's something that you have to decide given the reality of your situation. What resources do you have available? What is the harm that's happening out of this particular conversation? What resources and energy and time do you have to put into it? If you are fighting for, let's say there are prayers at your school's football games, and you'd like to do something about it, you can engage with that issue, and we have a number of students who do. But if you don't have the support from your parents, and your parents are religious, and then all of a sudden your community is fighting back at you, and your parents are fighting back at you, and you are isolated and alone, you may realize you don't have the emotional energy to continue to pursue that fight, and you have to back out, and that isn't wrong. There's no wrong answer there. I think maybe that's as important as anything else, that you've got to do what's best for you and put yourself first.
And on a related question, since you do this day in and day out, how do you deal with basically the fact that you are on a daily basis fighting a fight you shouldn't have to fight?
That's a good question. I guess I don't think about it that way very often. I think very pragmatically in that, boy, it sure would be great if I didn't have to fight this fight, but here we are. And I can't change that overnight. Hopefully the work that I'm doing will help change it, on a scale of years or decades. But right now, the best I can do is have this conversation, and this conversation will make it a little bit better. It'll make it a little bit easier next time, and maybe gain me some allies so that the next conversation I go into, I've got more people on my side about it. So I really think just, one day at a time, one step at a time, and keep your view on that end goal of we're going to make it better.
And since it is such a small steps kind of process, how do you measure success on a regular basis? How do you know you're making progress so you stay heartened?
This is a good question, and I think it's incredibly important that you do measure success on a personal level, because that's going to keep you sane. If you're doing this on an organizational level, because that's how you tell people that you're succeeding in your mission, and you get people to fund your work. So the metrics are important. There's a number of different metrics we can use. Some of the things we look at the Secular Student Alliance are how many people we're reaching and how many people are coming to us. So how many student groups do we have right now? How active are those student groups? In terms of this particular issue, how well accepted are those student groups? Are we having groups, well, a very real example, it is very rare for me to have to go to a college right now and tell the college that you're breaking the law by not allowing this secular group. By and large, colleges have figured this part out. And that wasn't the case when I started this position 5-6 years ago. And so that's a metric of success. Likewise, 5 years ago, IFYC and the Secular Student Alliance did not get along at all. We were kind of at each other's throats. In the years since then, IFYC is one of our strongest partners in exactly this kind of work, this kind of interfaith, intersectional, addressing privilege kind of conversations. And so that's a metric of success. So just making sure you keep the perspective on where you've been and where you are now. Some of the bigger indicators are things like some of these polls that are happening about discrimination and prejudice and stereotypes, opinion polls. The poll they run every election year of, would you vote for a blank for president? And atheists are always just the bottom of the pile. Yes, we're the bottom of the pile, but we're over 50% now. So even those little changes, went from being only 42% of Americans would vote for an atheist to like 52% of people would vote for an atheist. That's progress. So recognize those progress steps.
All right. And I will check back in the chat room one more time. No, aside from really being interested in the managing up concept, and people are going to go look at that and check that out,
Good.
I think we do not have any more questions. So if you have anything else you'd like to say or before we go, otherwise I'll let you go.
I am just going to pop this slide right back up here. There are two resources listed on this slide here. Openly Secular is at openlysecular.org, and the Secular Safe Zone, which is at secularsafezone.org, are both resources that have a lot of great information aimed not just at the secular community, but also at religious and theistic allies to help address some of these issues. So both of those are going to be resources that are going to be valuable if you're having these conversations or looking into these issues. I really encourage you to check them out.
All right. Thank you so much, Liz, and thank you everybody who's tuned in.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon.